You say something in Mandarin, a native speaker corrects you and you adjust. The next day, another native speaker tells you that this is wrong and that you should revert to your original phrasing. What's going on? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. The topic this week is native speakers, and since this is the Hacking Chinese podcast, we're talking about native speakers of Mandarin Chinese. Most of what I say, however, will be relevant for native speakers of any language, and I want to make it clear from the very start that the idea here is not to bash native speakers of any language. It is simply to point out some things that ought to be obvious, but clearly aren't for a lot of people. This includes a younger, less experienced version of myself, because I ran into situations like the one I described in the introduction many times before realizing that this is the rule, not an exception. There could be several reasons why somebody says you have to say A instead of B, and then the next day somebody says you actually have to say B instead of A. The most common one actually isn't that the native speakers disagree on how to say something, it is that you have misunderstood the feedback, or that the context is different and therefore the word usage would be different, or something like that. To make sure that you understand feedback you get, I think it's a good habit to always repeat back when somebody corrects you. This way you know that you understood the feedback correctly and also that your adjustment is correct. If you don't do this, it could very well be that they are commenting on something else. This happens not only with word choice, of course, but also with things like pronunciation. Maybe you think they are correcting your initial, but actually they are correcting your tone. And then if you misunderstand this, then obviously you will not be able to adjust. However, in situations where you seem to get contradictory advice for how to say things, it could also be that one of the native speakers is actually wrong, at least according to some standard. This is what I want to explore in this episode, namely what native speakers know and, maybe more importantly, what they don't know and what you need to keep in mind when learning Chinese and interacting with native speakers. Perhaps the most important thing I want to say in this episode is that native speakers don't know everything about their language. And to some of you this will sound blindingly obvious. Of course they don't, but there's a surprisingly large number of people who either think that they are infallible as native speakers, and also a lot of non-native speakers who idolize native speakers, thinking that they know everything or can answer all types of questions. I think it's important to realize that people learn language according to their needs and interests, and since we are very different in these regards, it follows that the language we end up with is not the same. You, dear reader, have a stronger interest in language than most people do. I can know that rather confidently simply by the fact that you tuned into this episode. Most people don't do that, and they don't think about learning other languages or teaching them, or indeed much about how languages work at all. For normal people, the language is just something they grew up with and something they use to achieve other purposes or to do things in life. It is not a subject of study or something they think much about. In this sense, we can think of a native speaker as a fish in water. And if you want to learn how to swim, it makes sense to study how it moves. And if you want to know about the ocean floor, maybe ask the fish to see what it knows and what it has seen. However, if you want to ask questions about fluid dynamics or biomechanics, asking the fish is probably not the best option. The same is true if you want information about the ocean floor somewhere far away from here, because even if the fish has spent its whole life swimming around in the ocean is also huge and there are many places that this fish has never visited and can't really know anything about. Before we proceed with the discussion, I want to state clearly again that the idea here is not to bash native speakers of a specific language, Chinese in this case. This is true for native speakers of all languages. For example, I'm a native speaker of Swedish, and even though I have no formal education when it comes to teaching Swedish to foreigners, I've done so quite a lot, and there are lots of things I don't know or can't explain. This is natural and there's nothing wrong with it. Nobody knows everything about everything. It's just that in this article, where we talk about a group of people I'm not part of, it might seem highly critical, as if I'm saying that you are not good or something like that. But that is not my intention. I've learned almost all the Chinese I know from native speakers, and I'm immensely grateful to everybody who has helped me along the way. Still, being mindful of their limitations is crucial for dealing with situations such as the one I mentioned in the introduction, which is why I have recorded this episode. Another thing I want to discuss briefly before we talk about what native speakers know and what they don't know is what we mean when we use words like right and wrong talking about native speakers. Again, you as a listener might have reacted differently here depending on your background. To some of you, it might seem obvious that there is such a thing as a right and wrong in a language. I mean, there are official dictionaries and government agencies that decide what is right and wrong, and if you follow that, you're right, and if you don't, you're wrong. This prescriptive approach is not very useful when it comes to dealing with native speakers, in my opinion. Let people speak the way they want, it's their language after all. But it's not obvious that this also extends to second language learners. The reason it's a good idea to follow the standard as a second language learner is not that it is a standard per se, but rather that this standard happens to be easy to understand for a large majority of the Chinese population. This is not a point I want to argue in this episode, but I have written about it on Hacking Chinese before, in the article Standard Pronunciation in Chinese and Why You Want It, which is episode 119 on the podcast. But this episode is about native speakers, not second language learners. To some of you at least, the idea that a native speaker can be wrong about their own language is itself suspect. A language is defined by the people who use it after all, and if native speakers think that something is correct, well, then it has to be correct by definition. Or perhaps words like correct, right, wrong, incorrect, and so on simply don't apply to this discussion. This descriptive approach is what most linguists are interested in and completely dominates in academia. We're interested in studying, and teaching for that matter, how the language is used, not how governments say it ought to be used. It's easy to show that you probably want this as a second language learner as well. If you had to choose between being officially correct or say things like most other people say them, for example, which one would you choose? If we look up the word for download in Chinese in an official dictionary, it will say 下载 with 2 fourth tones, but this pronunciation is very rare and most people say 下载 with a third tone on the second syllable. So if most people pronounce it like that, do you still insist and want to learn the correct version? Well, if you have an exam and they will deduct points for it, maybe, but most people, I think, just want to talk in a way that most other people talk and be sure that they are understood. The question of whether or not Chinese native speakers can be wrong about Chinese grammar and pronunciation is something I have discussed in an article before, which hasn't made it to the podcast yet, but I'll put a link in the show notes. Let's explore in more detail what native speakers know and, more importantly, what they don't know. As I said earlier, people learn the language they engage with and that they are interested in, and that is required of them socially or depending on the context they are in. This means that native speakers learn the pronunciation, grammar, and so on of the language communities they engage with as they grow up, first at home, then in school, and then in wider society. At least the first two very rarely adhere to government standards. This is worth highlighting here because I think the most common reason native speakers disagree when it comes to what is correct is that they have a different regional background. China is vast and the population is huge, and there are Chinese speakers outside of China too, so people will speak in different ways. Most people who speak Mandarin in China don't have it as their first language. Expecting a billion people to agree when it comes to word choice, grammar, and so on is a little bit naive. So keep this in mind, regionally accented Mandarin is a thing, and most people you speak Mandarin with will have some kind of accent which isn't the standard one, and this will influence how they answer your questions and what they consider correct and not. Next, let's focus on something else that makes native speakers different from each other. We keep learning our native language as we grow up in school and at work and so on, so which choices we make in life and where we end up greatly impacts the language that we learn and the language that we use. A nurse, for example, is good at medical terminology and can communicate effectively with colleagues and patients. A journalist, however, might not be as good at that, but they are on the other hand very good at writing and also presumably reading because they do a lot of research and you need to read a lot to write well. Compare this with a teacher who might have formal training and maybe courses in linguistics and tend to think about language quite a lot, maybe as prompted by student questions. It should be clear that these people will know different aspects of the Chinese language and they are good at different things. In addition to this, interests, hobbies, and so on also influence what a native speaker knows and what they don't know. And if we combine all types of backgrounds, professions, and so on, we end up with a billion unique individuals who all know different things about their native language. In this light, it is then very strange to assume that all these people would answer the same question the same way. This is not to say that a certain combination of background, profession, and interests is better than another, but it is worth keeping these things in mind when you receive feedback on your Chinese. Most of the things I've said so far are certainly true for the spoken language, but I think it's worth talking about the written language a little bit extra. Spoken language is something we learn naturally growing up, and this is what it means to be a native speaker, but the written language is different. The written language is something that we have invented or something that humans have created. It is not something natural in that sense. You also don't learn to read and write just by using the language. Most people learn that in school, and in modern society, of course, most people do learn to read and write. But this is different from learning to speak and understand your native language orally. One way of putting it would be to say that the spoken language is a dance, and then the written language would be the choreography notes you use to describe that dance. It should follow then that knowing how to dance doesn't automatically imply that you know how to write notes for it. Or, as I said earlier, a fish doesn't need to know about fluid dynamics and biomechanics to be able to swim. This means that when it comes to the written language specifically, it is rather important who is giving feedback because native speakers differ a lot with how much time they spend with the written language. Someone who works with a written language and reads all the time will probably be better suited to give you advice about writing than someone who avoids the written language whenever they can. Let's move on to explicit knowledge and asking questions about the Chinese language. As I've said a few times now, don't count on fish being able to explain fluid dynamics, and similarly, don't expect native speakers to be able to explain their own language. This is not needed to speak it, just like it's not necessary to know how an engine works in order to be able to drive a car. This means that most people are bad at explaining their own language. If they pay explicit attention to language themselves and tend to maybe read and listen a lot and are very observant and good at introspection, they might be able to give you ad hoc explanations sometimes, but this is not terribly reliable. They can, after all, only rely on experiences they've had, and if those are, for example, tied to a specific region, then the answer might not be the one you're looking for. This happens to me when I try to explain Swedish as well. If I have to explain the difference between two words in a sentence, I can probably come up with an ad hoc explanation that kind of works and maybe works in 90% of cases. But if it's a trickier question about grammar or something like why are you going down on this word here intonation-wise in this sentence, well, I can just shrug and say I don't know. I can look it up, but I don't know. If teaching languages has taught me anything, it is humility. There are so many things we don't know, even about our native language. So you, as a learner, might of course have questions about Chinese that you ask native speakers, and depending on what the questions are and whom you ask, you will then get answers that are more or less reliable. Let's look at 3 potential questions. The first one is, what are the main usages of le? The second one is, how is the third term pronounced? And the third one is, what's the difference between 尽量 and 尽量, and how are they written? If you pose these questions to someone without formal training, you're unlikely to get helpful answers. Like I said, someone with a keen interest in language and who's observant and so on might be able to give you an answer to the word choice question, the third one, but the other two, no. Again, fish don't need to know about fluid dynamics or biomechanics to be able to swim in the ocean. Another problem when asking native speakers this type of question is that you can't really trust the answer. There is a good rule of thumb here though, and that is that the more confident the native speaker sounds, the less you should trust them. Teachers who say things like, this is my spontaneous intuitive answer, but I'll check with the corpus and get back to you, are much more reliable than those who just give you an answer and seem very confident about it. As I said earlier in this episode, many native speakers vastly overestimate how much they know about their native language, and second language learners are not far behind in this regard. As a side note, a question might have popped up here, and that is if native speakers can use the language without being able to explain it, do you as a second language learner actually need these explanations to be able to speak yourself? The answer is that no, you don't. Languages are largely learned implicitly, and you don't need these theoretical things really. This doesn't mean that they can be helpful for adult language learners in certain contexts. For example, I often bring up the third tone as an example of this on the podcast. It is possible, indeed quite common, to misunderstand how the third tone works, and if you don't hear what people are saying, you will not correct yourself, and if nobody else points this out to you, you will never fix the problem. If you want to learn more about the third tone, I suggest you check out episode 26. Still, even if explicit knowledge and instruction can be helpful for highlighting things and making you aware of things you didn't pay attention to before, it is much more limited than most people think. This means that the simple solution to the problem of native speakers not being good at explaining Chinese is simply to not ask them about it. Just read what they write and listen to what they have to say. So, what's the point of this episode? I think that a deeper understanding of what native speakers know, and as I've said, more importantly, what they don't know, is important for us as second language learners. It will make it easier for you to make sense of situations such as the one I talked about initially when native speakers contradict each other, and it will make you better equipped to get feedback and make the most out of the feedback that you get. Native speakers don't have perfect knowledge about all aspects of their language, no matter how confident they are, and this is especially true for explaining the language, as we have seen. This means that being in a situation where two native speakers disagree with something is not very uncommon at all, and this is not strange either. They have different backgrounds, they come from different regions, they have different professions, and have different interests. Sometimes the conflicting answers you get are both delivered with extreme confidence. I've been in situations where a teacher, who should know better, claims everybody says A, not B, and that X is always wrong, and you have to say why, even though I know that these answers are in fact not correct. If you want to learn more about things you might have learned in Chinese class that are actually wrong, you can check out episode 27 or check the link in the show notes. To wrap this episode up, here are a few takeaways. First, for you as a language learner, be aware that native speakers vary greatly in their language ability and explanatory skills. Rely on them for practical language exposure, but don't count on them being able to explain their own language. Next, don't focus too much on explicit knowledge. There are some situations where this can help, but they are rarer than you think. Read and listen more instead. Next, if you do want explicit knowledge about some aspect of learning Chinese, make sure you ask a professional teacher or someone with a background in this area. Someone being a Chinese teacher doesn't automatically guarantee that their answers are good, but someone who has a lot of credits in, say, Chinese syntax are much more likely to give you good answers about syntax than someone who hasn't. Teachers are also wrong sometimes. Some of them don't have a formal education, and going through one doesn't guarantee that you suddenly become humble and observant and realize that you maybe don't know everything about your language. I would be more worried about a teacher who never expresses any doubt about anything than someone who is wrong occasionally. And if you are a language teacher, be open about the limits of your knowledge. Admitting gaps is not a weakness, it's an opportunity to learn and grow. And no one knows everything about their native language, and that's okay. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.